Hi, I'm Patricia Vallone with CTV News. With me now is Sean Gladden. He's the Executive Director of the Howard County Historical Society. He's going to talk a little bit about the last pandemic that we had, which was in 1918, the world pandemic of the Spanish flu. And why don't we start by give us a brief history of what that was?
Right. So the Spanish flu, which was contracted right around the same time, obviously, as the contracted and spread right at the end of World War One, was the last major, I guess you could say, pandemic that not only we've seen here in the United States, but also globally, responsible for millions of deaths around the world, hundreds of thousands of deaths here in the United States. There are certainly lessons that should have been learned from 102 years ago. Some we seem to have learned and some we seem to not have learned, but there definitely are some parallels.
Well, let's talk about some of the similarities first. What are the similarities between that pandemic and what is happening now?
I mean, I can't speak to the scientific nature of it, but I can certainly speak to the historical nature. And one of the things for sure is, historically speaking, with regards to the 1918 pandemic and what we're dealing with today, is that the biggest lessons is that we weren't honest, and our politicians weren't honest about this early enough. Many historians who look at the lessons to be learned from the Spanish flu of 1918 is that we should have, as a society, we should have been more transparent about it from the get-go. But see, we were in wartime. Pretty much all the warring nations, all the major industrialized warring nations during World War I had really put a lockdown on what news was going out. Everyone was controlling the information. And one of the reasons that actually it's called the Spanish flu is because Spain was a neutral country during World War I, and they didn't have any controls on their free press. So they were the first ones to actually report on the pandemic. So there's no evidence that actually began in Spain. Spain was the first one that was widely reporting it. And once again, this goes back to the whole world is at war. So, you don't want to create a panic when you're already at war by telling the public about this pandemic. However, by not telling the public about the pandemic, by not enforcing, what we would call stay-at-home or quarantine laws, it just spread exponentially. So, I think when we look at some of these comparisons, at least what I can speak of on my expertise, obviously the way humans react to these things are the patterns that we historians look at. And certainly there are parallels with the way politicians, for obvious reasons, you don't want to start a panic. It's not politically advantageous in an election year, certainly, to have to deal with something like this. And so you downplay it. And when you downplay it, at least the lessons from 1918 are, you only make it worse because you're not getting the information out there that the public really needs.
Let's talk about Philadelphia. That was one of the hardest hit in 1918, and that was pretty much due to a parade that was held. Tell us a little bit about that.
I can't speak so much onto the incident itself, but I can talk about the mindset. The mindset at the time in America, there was two ways to deal with this once it started to reach levels that it was known that it was spreading throughout the country, was the idea that you should push the virus through by continuing to get together, basically expose the public to the virus so it works its way through the public quickly, and then the human immune systems can catch up to the virus. And in many of these previous viral incidents that had occurred, that seemed to work. I think, if I remember correctly, about 20 years prior to the Spanish flu, there was a flu that had come through America, like in 1899. 1898 and 1899, there was a flu, and it just kind of worked its way through the public. And there was a strong feeling that that's what they should do with the Spanish flu. So Whereas I can't speak to the specifics of the parade, I can talk about what the mindset was at the time. Is what we as Americans need to do is just get out and go about our business. They were just as concerned about the economy as we are today. And they wanted people to go about their business because they wanted the flu to work its way through. So it was some flawed thinking at the time, and the parade in Philadelphia, as I understood it, was kind of part of that flawed thinking. They just did not understand the nature of this flu.
So it's almost the same kind of old school thinking about when chickenpox, before the vaccine came along. You get all of your family and friends together so they all have it at once, and you don't have to deal with it for a whole year.
Exactly. And of course, we didn't have anywhere near the health services 102 years ago that we have today. I mean, my understanding is we were still doing bloodletting with leeches 102 years ago. You know, we still had some archaic understandings of medical practices. So, you know, and that's one of the reasons why not only, well, the social contact is what many historians say is why it spread, but then not being able to control it was due to the arcane nature of our healthcare at the time. So at least we do have, more, I guess you could say more up-to-date medical tactics, but still, as we can all see, you know, without having the proper information in place at the time, you know, our people are overwhelmed.
So one of the things, you know, we're talking about some of the similarities. What's different about today's crisis? They shut down a lot of their transportation and things like that, which we have done as well. But social media, they obviously didn't have that.
Right. And I actually, the transportation thing is interesting. They didn't shut the transportation down in time, because historians say the reason the flu spread as it did is because we were in the final year of a world war. And whereas in the United States, my understanding is the outbreak was, well, the first diagnosed case was in Kansas, at a hospital in Kansas. And then I believe the outbreak began or can be traced back to a military fort some 22 miles away from that hospital. And if you understand, once it was in the military camps, and this is 1918, these soldiers are being transferred to different camps all over the United States and then eventually to Europe. And in these, my understanding, and the historian to look at for this is a man by the name of John Barry, who has written a pretty influential book on the history of the Spanish flu. I've been seeing him on numerous interviews doing exactly what I'm doing here. He's more obviously the expert. But I've read a little bit of his work, and he pinpoints the troop movements in these troop transports. This is where the flu just went rampant. And I believe he refers to one troop transport. I believe it was a cruise ship that was altered to be a troop transport. It was called the Leviathan. But he puts the rapid spread of this on the mobilization of troops in that last year before last year of World War I. Also, something else that we should definitely look at from John Barry's research is the flu originally hit in the summer of 1918. And I think it hit in Kansas, went away, and then it came back with a vengeance in the fall. So when we talk about the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, what we're really looking at is there's two phases, and it's the second phase that was the worst. And obviously, as we can all imagine, that is when everybody thought everything was okay. So they resumed activities, and then by September, October, it's a full-on pandemic. So with regards to the spread, troop transports, and then relaxed restrictions on social contact too early, and it came back with a vengeance later that year.
Very important lesson to learn from that. Tell us, I understand tens of thousands of Americans died during that time, and that was when the population was less than a third of what we have right now. Right. So how did they finally recover?
Well, there's a lot of after effects of the Spanish flu. It's an interesting time. World War I ends, and the Spanish flu, which would it would plague the global world for another 2 years. But the economy, you got to understand, the economy is going to bounce back big time in the 1920s. And I think one of the reasons why you kind of don't hear a whole lot about the Spanish flu throughout the 1920s is because the economy is doing so well. So, couple lessons to be learned from at least, from what I understand from John Barry's work is, because the economy bounced back so quickly, the Spanish flu was not, the fear and paranoia of the Spanish flu kind of went away by the mid 1920s, which is another lesson to be learned, because John Barry makes a very interesting point. I saw him on an interview where he discusses the fact that this is one of the worst pandemics in American history, and literally 2 years after it happened, we weren't talking about it anymore. So, and people were literally scared. And John Barry talks about in his books that returning soldiers who were affected from the Spanish flu, it was so horrific to look at that doctors couldn't tell the difference between white patients and African-American patients, because those who were infected with the flu turned almost a dark blue color. So you read about, and John Barry makes a very interesting point about this, is the horrific nature of all of this. And literally 2-3 years afterwards, we forget about it. And a lot of that may come from the suppression of information. People didn't want the horrific nature of this to get out. So from a historical standpoint, we know the numbers, but we don't really know the true harms of this 2-3 year period. And the best answer I can give to why that paranoia didn't linger is, once again, the Roaring '20s, right? People are coming back from the war. They, it's the era of prohibition. People are doing their speakeasy thing, and they're focusing on making money in the stock market, and farmers are seeing some of the greatest yields that they had seen in almost a generation. So Spanish flu took a back seat to some extent.
So tell me, what are the lessons that we can learn from a century ago?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things also is, because it was labeled as a Spanish flu, it was mischaracterized as something that obviously originated in Spain. And take the end of World War I, take the flu epidemic, and just take generally this xenophobia that was running wild in America after World War I. And I think these are the lessons we need to learn, okay? Calling this flu, or naming a flu after a nationality or after a geographic region, doesn't help. Misleading the public and making something like this think that it isn't as bad as it actually is doesn't help. And not mobilizing a clear-cut message from the top down. Woodrow Wilson was guilty of this as well. So as much as we want to criticize the current president, I mean, he's in good company. It seems that these politicians just don't seem to read their history books. But, the blueprint for how not to deal with this, I mean, it's right there. So lessons to be learned, open a history book.
All right. Thank you so much, Sean Gladden. I'm sorry, we had a bit of a problem with the uplink. We've had some visual things that are coming through there, but the message has been very important. So we want to thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thank you. Stay safe, stay inside.
You too.